Up on the all the pictures.
Friday after 4. I can just drive my Friday from 5 to 5:15.
Thought you had another good story for me.
This guy's got to be a monkey too. We're definitely going Monday because if we can go to Belfor, do our thing. It's going to be like this.
That's fine, no photography.
Yeah,
oh ja, en zoals van
What is the monkey suit?
Brian and I are going to figure it out.
de rechterhand van die ook in. Oh ja, Falcone. Ja, die rechterhand van
Yeah.
zij heeft hem daarna opgevolgd tegen de ik ben zo'n grap.
So you're going to go on Saturday?
I'll be back, yeah, I'm leaving Saturday. I'm coming back.
Okay. Where are you going? There's also a big bash Friday night downtown. Actually, it costs like $25 to get like a
Ik wil wel apart
3-hour
gezegd.
drink.
Helemaal bijhouden waar iedereen voor en tegen heeft gestemd. Is dat hier zo? Er was voor gewoon binnen een week was Peter afdaan.
Mensen heel belangrijk in Nederland.
En in principe vind ik dat wel logisch, want dan was je voor je punt mee weten hoe hij zich gaat gedragen.
Ja, dat zeker. In Nederland wordt er ook per fractie gestemd. En als er iemand uit de fractie stemt, niet anders stemt, dan wordt er eigenlijk niet zo erg gelet. Als er maar een meerderheid, een duidelijke meerderheid is, maakt het niet uit wie ervoor stemt en wie tegen stemt.
Ja. Maar het is minder duidelijk of de fracties straks dat ook weer krachtig is.
Ja. In Nederland kun je als politicus vrij anoniem zijn.
Maar je hebt twee typen, want je bent hier wat minder recht. Bij ons meer zeg maar, onderzoekers op de achtergrond als het ware. Onderzoek maken. En jij hebt mensen die echt in de spotlight staan.
Ja.
Wat is van die Dit is wel een beetje een gekke plek eigenlijk. Dit is altijd dat is een beetje van de Kennedy School, dat is redelijk zeker van wie elkaar zit, wordt links. En met mensen dit is hun auditorium. Al die banken, die nissen en zo naar boven, dat is allemaal podia.
Het is wel omdat je ruimte gebruikt. Je maakt wel goed gebruik van je ruimte. Je kunt hier heel makkelijk met mensen overleggen en zo. Dat wel.
Ik vind die lampen heel irritant, dat snel alles op de camera.
Ja.
Dit zijn ook open mics, dus straks kun je ook mensen vragen stellen.
Mij zijn er best veel voor.
Excuse me. What language are you speaking?
It's Dutch. Yeah, it's from Holland.
Yes, we've all heard about it for quite some time.
Gaelic, I haven't heard that before.
Oh, I couldn't place what it was.
It's still very far away from that.
Wouldn't that funny if you're like actually that far?
I'm sorry, there are two James.
We're hoping to get some ideas, actually.
Well, you guys, actually, yeah, we are too. I think we're kind of just, the return on investment, like, is really rapidly diminishing for every extra hour we put into this whole thing, so we may stick with what we got. It's just because of a lot of it. It is. No matter what we say, it's going to like suck. So after a certain point, it's like, whatever. And it's fun. It's great. It's just like I'm not going to let my friends like I know it's not.
You know, I read somewhere that his tenure at DoD was like big scandal.
We zijn toch maar echt iemand monitoren en zo.
I hear, I mean, really like he owned the last
Daar zullen ook wat tussen zijn.
I mean,
De Schumer versie was toen helemaal afgelaten veiligheid. Toen was Intifada ook, nou,
it might have been because he
toen was Intifada ook behoorlijk opgeleid.
So I don't know if you can just cite that. Oh my, he already done it.
No, he already has like three.
Excuse me? He's like, I mean,
He's gonna luck out on the latest one too.
that's definitely, that's just what we'll always have to look for.
He's gonna luck out on that.
Yeah. And that's fine. We know it's not the end. That's definitely good right on that.
Yeah.
It'll be like, you'll be reading the paper one day and it's phones will pick up, and I'll be like, oh my God.
I get singled out.
She knows now. She was like, I don't know. Yeah, honey. You're like James there at the store. I know. You both were like, oh my God. I wish y'all could have been there for that whole thing. I wish everybody could have been there for that. No, he called me too, so it's not, that's not public knowledge. James apparently told you. So James laughed and
At this point,
like, like, I was going to be like, sit down.
Test.
Een mysterieuze vierde stoel.
To make sure test.
Ja.
Check. Test. Test.
This should be, it will come after half an hour. We need this mic down and we'll have mic on the person who is coming. So
Okay.
once he's coming, he will not listen to.
Okay. Yeah, just make sure the mic is on when you give it. Okay.
Soms in de zaal, dat maakt je ook bij de rest.
Yeah, I felt it gave me a heads up more than like 2 hours in advance. I already told my roommates about it. Just so you know, as soon as we get the date and you might want to make plans to be somewhere else, they're like, yes, we will.
Jeff should bring them like a gift.
A new box, he does owe me a new box of tins. It's still there, crumpled in. I leave it there just to laugh at. Oh, that's right. She said her bathroom smells right. Like, the bathroom goes in her bathroom. Just like, in the bathroom. Goes right into her room. She said she heard, she's like, oh, and I was like trying to pin down the time because I actually figured out when it happened. Sure. Exact time. So they couldn't bet. I was when she showed me. I thought she was gonna. I felt like I was being back. I felt like a child. I was like, oh my god. And then she turned out to be cool. Actually, she was great. Now we laugh about it. I just felt like I heard Jeff. It's the bathroom.
Breaking hearts.
It's really incredible.
All this one is like
volgende keer ook een ander script, ja.
Ja.
Degene wat ouder is, want Leiden heeft ook.
Ja, nee, maar ze hebben alle subscholen hier.
Oh, subschool.
Dus ik wist het
Maar
niet
wel
ander dan...
dezelfde. Want Veritas ook.
Ja. Dat is wel.
Dat is wel. Here's a camera.
Hello. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Carrie Lamack, and I want to welcome you to an evening of discussion about the most deadly kind of terrorism that we have today and what we can do to prevent it. I'm pleased to be joined by some of the world's foremost experts in the subject. We'll hear from them soon. As some of you may remember, last year was an election year, and the two candidates squared off in 3 debates, which we watched here in the forum at the Kennedy School. They bantered about foreign policy, domestic issues, and the like, and I would argue that they agreed on very little. But there was one thing they did agree on. When asked what was the most dangerous threat posed to the United States right now, both of the candidates said it was the use of nuclear material by terrorists. With such an unheard of agreement in a presidential debate, one can hardly imagine either candidate not making it the top priority of his administration. But tonight I want to ask you, in all that you have seen since the election, has the President of the United States or the Senator of this great Commonwealth made securing loose nukes and nuclear material his top priority? Did his actions belie his words? I'm here tonight not only as an MPA student at the Kennedy School, but also as a concerned citizen. My mother was murdered on September 11th, and since then I have realized that there's too much at stake to, and don't take any offense to this, to give the benefit of the doubt to our elected officials. It's up to us to hold them accountable, and that's why we're here tonight. We're joined by other 9/11 family members in the audience. It's good to see you guys. Thank you for coming. But seeing them makes me wonder something. I wonder if there was a nuclear bomb that went off by terrorists, how could we possibly house all of the families that would be affected in one room, or even one stadium? I can't imagine a place where we could hold all those people. The purpose of tonight's forum is not to scare you or alarm you, although some of what they're going to say tonight just might do so. Instead, it's to give you the information, to hold people accountable, and to empower you to make a difference. You will see on the chairs tonight that you're all sitting on, you probably already have seen them, there's going to be pamphlets with information. There's things that you can do tonight, tomorrow, this weekend to make a difference. Easy things, like sending a note to your congressmen and senators, letting them know that securing nuclear material is important to you. You can sign up online to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that was started by 2 senators, Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar, and their goal is to reduce the global threat of weapons of mass destruction. NTI, which is the Nuclear Threat Initiative, is actually the organization that created the movie that we're going to see clips from tonight. If you want to see the movie in its entirety, and I'm sure that you do because Senator Fred Thompson plays the president, and you might remember him from Hunt for Red October or Law and Order. A lot of us like that show. You can order a free copy on their website, which is www.nti.org. Again, I want to thank you all for coming tonight and hope that you will join us in adding your voice to this issue. Even a small amount of time can make a huge difference in stopping nuclear terrorism, something that our panel tonight is going to tell you is preventable. So without further ado, I turn it over to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carrie. Our 4th panelist, Kurt Weldon, is just getting mic'd up. It'll be here by the time we get started. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfor Center for Science and International Affairs. I want to welcome you tonight for what I think is going to be a very interesting and informative evening. Carrie already mentioned the presidential debate. It's hard to imagine that it was just a year ago. We were in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, and it was certainly correct that in the first of the televised presidential debates, the moderator asked the 2 candidates, what is the single most serious threat to American national security? And they both said nuclear terrorism. Hello, Kurt Weldon. Nice to see you.
Hello, Kurt. How are you doing? Good.
Hey, Kurt. Good to see you.
Right. That's a bipartisan kiss.
Exactly.
Pretty impressive, huh?
Kurt, we're just starting and we're just introducing the topic. In the last month of the campaign, Vice President Cheney picked up this proposition that President Bush had stated in the televised presidential debate. And let me quote what Cheney put. This was kind of a centerpiece of his stump speech. He says, quote, this is in Ohio, October 2004. The biggest threat we face now as a nation is the possibility of terrorists ending up in the middle of one of our cities with deadlier weapons than have ever been used against us, nuclear weapons, able to threaten the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Then he goes to his punchline. Quote, that's the ultimate threat. For us to have a strategy that's capable of defeating that threat, you've got to get your mind around that concept, close quote. As somebody who studied this problem for a long time, I would say right on. That indeed, if you were to state the objective tonight, it's to help us as citizens get our mind around the concept of just one nuclear bomb exploding in just one city and ask how we would think about that and as a consequence, what we should be doing to prevent that from happening. To assist us in getting our mind around the concept, NTI, as Kerry has said, has made this docudrama on nuclear terrorism called Less Best Chance. Some of you will have seen it on HBO last week, and I think it's going to be on HBO again next week, but we'll get a chance tonight to see clips from it. The game plan tonight, we're going to start with snippets from the Last Best Chance movie. 2-minute little clips, after which we're going to go to our panelists, and I'll put to them a question, and we'll get very brief answers, just basically questions that are validating what you've seen. Does it seem realistic? Does this seem about like the way it is, or do you have a different view? We've got 4 or 5 such clips. We're then going to have some discussion among the members of the panel, and then finally we're going to go to the audience for questions and answers. So does that seem complicated enough? Okay. Now, to assist us tonight, we're very, very lucky to have 3 extraordinary members of Congress, 2 current members and 1 senator who just has left the Congress and fortunately is here with us at the Kennedy School this year. Let me start with Jane Harmon to my left. Jane is a Democratic member of the House from Los Angeles. She represents the district from Venice down to LA, Long Beach, including the LAX airport and the port, which is actually the busiest port in America. She's been one of the clearest voices on the Democratic side of the House on issues of national security. She is the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee and a member of the Homeland Security Committee. Sitting beside her is Bob Graham. Bob Graham is an extraordinary public servant who, after a period as governor of Florida, served as senator, and as in his last role as senator, was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And as I said before, we have the good fortune to have him here with us and his wife Adele this year, in the fall at the Institute of Politics and in the spring at the Belfor Center. So we feel ourselves very lucky. These are issues that Bob has thought about for a long time and written about in his book on intelligence, which we'll hear more about here in the forum. And third, and certainly not least, is our good friend Kurt Weldon. Kurt is a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania in its 10th term. He's a senior member and has been the number 2 person on the House Armed Services Committee. He's also on the Homeland Security Committee, but closer to home here, I would say he's been the steadiest member in Congress in working with our program here at the Kennedy School for Russian generals, the program that we do for Russian general staff members and their U.S. equivalents. Indeed, I don't know of any member of Congress who can call by name more members of the Russian Duma or more members of the Russian security establishment. So Kurt has taken this issue right to hand and has been in the middle of trying to think his way through it, and it'll be very relevant for some of what we're just about to see. So let's go to the first clip, which will almost take Kurt to Russia. Yes.
В этом конверте ваша зарплата за 5 лет. Авиабилеты в Венгрию. Она же венгерка, ваша жена, да?
Да.
Венгерские паспорта на новые имена. А визы мы можем достать в любую страну мира, куда вы только с семьей захотите уехать.
А 2 боеголовки?
Только 2.
Не вынесу же их прямо через проходной?
Ну как? Мы дадим вам почти настоящие документы, чтобы вывести боеголовки на профилактику. Пожалуйста. Павел с одним нашим знакомым приедет на военном грузовике, чтобы отвезти их на профилактику. Все будет как обычно.
Потом ваши клиенты их используют. Погибнут тысячи людей.
Если не у нас, они достанут их где-нибудь еще.
So the first was in Russia, now we're in South Africa. So keep going with the lights down, please. This is a South African research lab.
Maybe you should explain what he's doing.
He's cutting slices of highly enriched uranium.
Have a pleasant holiday, Professor.
Do we have a third slice, or that's okay, let's stop at that one for a second. Here we have two slices from Last Best Chance. One in Russia, a buy being made. A second in South Africa, people getting the highly enriched uranium from which a terrorist could make a bomb. And let me start with Jane. I mean, as you've tried to look at this from the Intelligence Committee, or Bob or Kurt, how realistic are such scenarios?
Well, let me first say, Graham, that everyone in this audience is lucky to have Graham Allison at the Kennedy School. He's covered up this. This is what you need to read if you want to learn everything you need to know about how to prevent the proliferation of a weapon of mass destruction, the ultimate preventable catastrophe. I thank you for inviting all of us here. You are the fount, and I am a very grateful customer, I must say, in the United States Congress. And we all miss Bob Graham because he was such a leader on the Senate side, not just on this specific intelligence problem, but on the whole range of problems. And Kurt and I, as you saw from the KISS, work together in the House. In case you've heard that there is no bipartisanship, my answer is there's not much, but there's a little bit. And we are two who get along well and have for over a decade and work together. So there. As far as these snippets go, they're totally realistic. Bribery and corruption are not the only thing that go on in Russia, obviously. Kurt has a very well-developed sense of the pluses and minuses of our Russian relationship and the potential there, but nonetheless, that's totally realistic. And the notion that some lab scientist could cut up a piece of HEU, notice that it's not radioactive in that form, put it in his briefcase and walk out the door with no checks, is totally realistic. So those are two of a list of ways in which nuclear material could be smuggled out, and obviously once it's out, it could easily get in the wrong hands. And in case you missed it, how to make a bomb is on the internet.
Kurt, do you want to say anything?
Well, it was May 1997 that I took a bipartisan delegation to Moscow, one of many, with Steny Hoyer, a good friend of Jane and mine. And we had a meeting with General Alexander Lebed, who was a retired two-star general who had just left Yeltsin's side as his national security advisor. And I asked General Lebed to talk about the state of the military. And he said, our military is in total disarray. He said, our best war fighters have their morale has been ruined, and they're resorting to selling off the weapons that we built to use against you during the Cold War to help support their families. They feel betrayed by the motherlands. He said to us, let me give you an example. He said, when I was Yeltsin's security advisor, which he was for almost a year, that's how Yeltsin got him out of the presidential race that year. He said, I was asked to account for 132 small nuclear weapons. And he gave a very specific number, 132. And he said, we searched all over the country, all the Spetsnaz facilities, Ministry of Atomic Energy, Ministry of Defense facilities, and we could only locate 48. And I said, well, General, where are the rest? And he looked and he shrugged and he said, I have no idea. They could be destroyed. They could be waiting for someone to pay the right price. They could, in fact, be in someone's storage site that we don't know about, but we can't account for them. I came back and briefed the CIA on that, and they said, we just don't know, Congressman. We know they built these kinds of devices. And so we continued to push the case with the CIA, and I brought over, and actually 60 Minutes read my trip report in July of that year, and they did a 1-hour special in September of 1997. It was their lead story. And the story was an interview with Alexander Lebed and myself. And they interviewed Lebed in Moscow and me in Washington. And the conclusion was that Lebed, in fact, said what he said to us privately, publicly, that they couldn't account for almost 100 small nuclear devices. Well, the next day, the Russian Foreign Ministry called Lebed a liar and a traitor and said it could never happen. And the worst part was our government said we have no reason to doubt the word of the Russian government. Well, I was livid. So I brought over Dr. Alexei Yablokov. He's one of the leading scientists in Russia, leading member of the Academy of Sciences. And he testified before my subcommittee in October. And he said that what Lebed said is true. He said, I have members of the Academy who worked with Lebed and who worked on small atomic nuclear demolition munitions. And then we had Stanislav Lunev, the highest-ranking ever GRU defector, testify behind a curtain. He's living in this country now. And he said, my job when I was at the the Russian embassy in Washington was to locate sites where we could drop weapons. And so I had 3 Russians now publicly confirming what this snippet just said. And finally, I went over to Moscow in December of that year and met with Marshal Sergeyev, who was defense minister. And I said, Mr. General Sergeyev, you want me to help you with your nuclear problems up in Murmansk and Severodvinsk and Severomorsk. You want us to help you with your housing problem. If you want to continue, my party, a lot of my people in my party are saying you can't trust the Russians, don't work with them. I've got to know the truth. Is what Lebed said true? And in December of 1997, Marshal Sergeyev, across the table in the Ministry of Defense, said, yes, we built these devices. We know that you built them during the Cold War. They're called small atomic demolition munitions. And we know that you've destroyed yours, and I'll assure you that by the year 2000, we will have accounted for all of ours. Our problem is we just don't know. Now, there have been significant times when Russians have come out and said they had them. Dudayev has said on 2 occasions that he had access to nuclear weapons in Chechnya, and he threatened to use them. Now, that didn't happen either time, but there have been other cases where Russians have reported to have access to nuclear devices. We just don't know. Is it possible? Absolutely, because we had Russian officials telling us. And now they're openly acknowledging, if you read the kind of material that Graham puts out on a regular basis, which I do, the Russians are now openly admitting that, in fact, they produce these kinds of devices and don't really know for sure whether or not one of them can be accessed. So it is a significant problem, not just for Russia, but for the world.
Okay. Bob, do you want to add anything?
Well, this problem comes in many forms. Some of it is just basic incompetence or the lack of capability to properly secure these weapons. I believe Graham was there when we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Nunn-Lugar agreement in Moscow.
I thought that was Graham Nunn-Lugar.
Yeah,
No.
and should have been, or
Allison.
Allison. We, as part of that, visited a facility at a little town called Pokarov, which had been an agricultural research center, but in the last years of the Cold War, it was the center in which a variety of chemical and biological weapons, including anthrax, was being produced. We visited the museum where those extremely dangerous chemical and biological agents were being secured. This sounds so absurd as to be humorous, but it's not. Do you know what the security was on those vials of biological weapons? A piece of string that was tied around the commercial refrigerators in which they were located. The theory was if somebody broke into the refrigerator, they would break the string and therefore they would be uncovered. You do not have to go, however, to Puckarov to see this kind of vulnerability. Right here in this city, where there are laboratories developing highly enriched nuclear materials, which over 20 years ago were supposed to have high levels of security to protect them from inappropriate use, procedures that have yet to be installed. There's major national television attention to that issue within the last 3 weeks. So this is a truly global issue and is going to take the kind of aggressive response that Graham Allison has outlined and advocated.
Let's go to the second clip, which is the president, in this case Fred Thompson, trying to see what to do. Yeah.
My call. Charles, are you calling with news I can get even on CNN? I certainly hope you don't see it on CNN. Dmitry, we have credible information that someone is plotting to steal 2 of your tactical nukes. Not for the first time. We've always caught them. As far as we know, you have, Dmitry. But we have a credible source. This is a good start, but there's still much to do. As you know, you have dozens of facilities and hundreds of tons of nuclear materials that are not secure. Together, we started trying to lock it down 10 years ago. If we had finished that job, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But we both have layers of bureaucrats who are now fighting over trivial terms. For some, it is not so trivial. You demand access to our most sensitive nuclear sites. My intelligence people call that spying. I trust you, Charles, but we don't want spies poking around our facilities. We are not trying to spy, Dmitry, but I have to answer to my Congress, and they demand assurances that taxpayer dollars are going where they're supposed to. So deal with them. Tell them what is at stake. I'll tell my people as well. It'll take both of us to fix this. I don't know how many there are, where they are, or what I can do to stop them.
Sir, the horses are out of the barn.
Because we blew our chance to close the door.
Okay. In this instance, we see Fred Thompson as president of the U.S. trying to figure out what to do when he's got good information that terrorists are trying to buy nuclear weapons or nuclear material, and talking to a Russian president with whom he has a very good relationship, but they both seem to be struggling with something bigger than they are. Now, are they missing some other option in this bit of a scenario we see?
Well, I thought the Putin equivalent said something very useful, which is, so deal with them. That was about the president dealing with the Congress. Presidential leadership is absolutely critical to solving this problem. Remember, to quote this, the ultimate preventable catastrophe. There is a series of steps to be taken, and there are some laws on the books that, if they were fully funded and fully implemented, could make a very, very big difference. And I think that is where, if you have to pinpoint one thing to do, sustained attention by the President of the United States to this problem. This is not, you're not going to hear a rant against George Bush. I think we have never had the adequate amount of presidential attention. I think we had almost none in the first term of Bush, but there is more attention now. And I just would highlight something I read in today's New York Times about North Korea, in which, headline, U.S. widens campaign on North Korea, and it talks about specific efforts that we are trying to undertake and urge the neighbors of Korea to undertake to prevent the proliferation of weapons out of Korea, including denying overflight rights to aircraft and doing more to check at borders of entry and elsewhere for radiological materials. These are, little snippets of good news, but presidential focus, leadership and urgency are, to me, the keys to making this work.
What about other options in this situation, Kurt?
Well, we all wonder
if you were playing president or were president,
what a nuclear weapon would look like. Well, I brought one. This is a nuclear weapon. It's probably the only mock-up that exists in the country. It's been in every major media outlet in the country. It's been on Gentleman's Quarterly and all kinds of newspapers. And I had this made by a CIA agent after the story I just told you about with Lebed to try to highlight what we're talking about. This was built by a CIA operative from the specs, now listen to this, from our own DOE website. From our own DOE website back in the late 90s. This is a 155 millimeter gun-fueled artillery device. This device, if it had weapons-grade plutonium in it, could carry an impact of 1 to 10 kilotons. And you're going to get through what that would mean, but if we detonated that at Harvard Square, it would detonate all of the university and the surrounding areas and probably Boston. This kind of device basically has all the operational characteristics of what we call a suitcase nuke. This is a suitcase nuke. And again, this came from, the mechanics to build this came from the Department of Energy website used by a CIA former agent, Dr. Peter Pry, who built this for me. So that I could show people what we're talking about. So the point is, we haven't taken this seriously. We thought with the end of the Cold War that we'd all hold hands and sing in a circle and sing Kumbaya. But unfortunately, there are some people that just don't get that are out to cause problems. And what Jane says about leadership is critically important. And I've been as critical as she has on this administration, but I've also been critical on previous administrations, when we should have been enforcing arms control agreements and weren't. We had, and I could go through chapter and verse of violations of arms control agreements involving chemical, nuclear, biological precursors, nuclear capabilities, missile technologies, and then we see them ending up in the hands of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and North Korea. We wonder why. And so the point is that America has not taken this seriously. It is a real threat, and this is what we're talking about. Now, the likelihood of this, I think, is minimal being used in the U.S. The likelihood of a dirty bomb, a dirty nuke, I think, is probably somewhere in the 80 to 90% range.
Okay. Bob, do you want to add?
Well, I'm a believer in the principle that if you are going to try to influence other people, that you need to lead by example. And I don't think we've done a very good job of leading by example as an example. We repealed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in order to clear the way for our efforts at a space-based defense program. Number two, we have consistently degraded and underfunded international agencies that will play a key frontline role, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and Interpol, which is the international law enforcement agency. We've heard from both of the members of Congress as to what we've done domestically. So I would say, as president, the first step would be to say we are going to be the light to the world of our seriousness about this, and we will show that seriousness by our action, not just our words.
Okay, let's go to the next item, which would be, as Kurt already has suggested, suppose a 10-kiloton bomb, which might be the suitcase or something a little bit larger, which might be the size of this podium, were to explode. The next one is, how would the terrorists get the bomb into the U.S.? Let's do that one first. Okay. This is in Mexico.
You'll get the other half of the money when we are safely inside Chesapeake Bay. Machine tools pays even better than drugs.
This is the Canadian border.
Both Canadian citizens?
We are.
The question to here is, if a terrorist had a nuclear bomb in Canada or in Mexico, how hard is it to bring it to Boston or Washington or San Diego?
What you really need on this show is Lou Dobbs to give one of his reports on our loose borders. The answer, obviously, not very difficult. I have felt for a long time that the greatest vulnerability, if I were a terrorist, that I would look to exploit first, would be our seaports, and particularly those 20 million cargo containers, which are often packed in remote, unsupervised condition, placed on a ship, come across a long ocean voyage, and then have less than a 5% chance of inspection once they arrive in the United States. That's just another possible means of delivery.
If I could speak to that, but also the Canadian border, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, surrounded by my congressional district, are where 13 million of those containers come in and out each year. 3%, maybe it's up to 5%, are inspected in some careful way. We do have a few initiatives that check containers and check the bills of lading at the point of embarkation. But, oh, by the way, those initiatives don't apply to China, to pick one place, which is a source of a lot of the shipments that come to the United States. Huge, in case anyone's missed our trade situation, a huge amount of goods come out of China. And this year, twice, astute dock workers unloading these containers onto rail cars. They're not, well, they're checked in certain ways, but then they're loaded on rail in most cases, and they go in through a semi-submerged rail bed called the Alameda Corridor into the central U.S. At any rate, unloading those containers saw human beings get out of them. And twice, it was containers full of Chinese stowaways, undocumented immigrants, not terrorists, but it could have been terrorists. No reason it couldn't. The way these things are checked when they arrive is very little, but in addition to that, there are things called radiation portal monitors, which do pick up large amounts of radiation. However, highly enriched uranium, you can learn from Graham, is only needed in very small amounts to make a bomb, and it can be shielded inside a container, and these portal monitors miss it totally. So containers are one huge opportunity. So is I think it's a 4,000-mile Canadian border, most of which is unguarded, as you basically saw in that slide. And the only other thing I would point out there was the drivers of that truck were not Muslim males between 20 and 40. I think our operating assumption has to be that terrorists could be anybody. And a lot of them could be Americans. If we learned anything from the London bombings recently, we should learn that folks who live next door, or maybe your own kids, have the potential to become terrorists. And it's a pretty darn scary situation. And again, to focus on this threat, it is preventable if we have leadership and a sense of urgency about it.
Kurt, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think the likelihood of an actual nuclear device like this coming into the country is rather minimal. It is possible, but I think it's minimal. There is a real possibility of the use of a dirty nuke, which is a conventional weapon surrounded by nuclear waste, because nuclear waste is more easily obtainable. However, if you want to look at a case study, go read the book, The Sword and the Shield, The Secret Files of the KGB. In 1993, Vasily Mitrokhin, who was the chief archivist for the KGB, walked into our embassy in London and said, I want to turn myself in and I want to seek asylum in the US, and I'll give you all the notes that I've taken about KGB activities, including the pre-positioning of military hardware in your country. And our CIA turned him away. The British took him in, and he lived there until he died last year, and they assigned him to work with Dr. Christopher Andrew, a good friend of mine from Cambridge. Christopher Andrew and he, after they gave all this information in British intelligence, which they called the largest single source of information in history about the KGB, they wrote the book, The Sword and the Shield, and I had him testify before my committee when the book came out in 1998. But the fact is that what he said, and what Oleg Gordievsky said, and what other Russians that have now come clean have said, is that during the Cold War, Russia actually pre-positioned military equipment throughout Europe. Some of these sites that Mitrokhin identified were actually sites that they found materials, not nuclear, but materials, and sites in the US. And they did it through diplomatic drops, through diplomatic pouches, and by bringing it over the Canadian border. So is it possible? Yes. Where there's a will, there's a way. And my own opinion is, as Jane and everyone else has pointed out, we've not taken this issue seriously. And look at India and Pakistan. We sat there and watched while India and Pakistan both developed nuclear weapons, and then we expressed indignation after they had them. I mean, look at Iran. For the past 3 years, we've basically ignored Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. It got so frustrating me, I had to write a book about it, to take on the CIA, because I did not feel they were being honest and candid with the American people on Iran's buildup of nuclear capabilities. So it is a case of us taking this issue seriously, being aggressive in the pursuit of issues that not just like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also issues like securing those sites that are largely in the former Soviet Union, where there are massive amounts of weapons-grade plutonium stored. 2 years ago in August, I visited Krasnoyarsk 16, or Krasnoyarsk 26, which is one of the largest sites in the former Russia, where they have built 3 underground reactors in a city called Zeleznogorsk. We went down into the reactor. One is still operational, 2 have been shut down. I had 2 Democrat colleagues of mine, Sylvester Reyes and Solomon Ortiz. Nobody from our government, by the way. Not one person from our government. We got in through another external means. But after that, we were briefed on one of the Russians' largest storage of weapons-grade plutonium. Now, if you're a terrorist, that's what you want. You want a container about that size of weapons-grade plutonium. And what they said as we drove into the mountain was, we don't have enough security forces here. We don't have enough money to protect them. Now, convincing members of Congress to put more money into those programs is not easy, especially in my party. And part of it's because there is waste, there is abuse, But in the end, that's where we need to put, I think, more of our resources, because that's where the material ultimately comes from. Those facilities that produce weapons-grade plutonium.
The fourth segment here is what would happen if a small nuclear bomb, just one small nuclear bomb, exploded in just one city. And we've got a couple of blast maps that we'll look at. Here's DC. And if that seems too far away, we made a local one, which I think is on the back of your handout. Let's go to here's Cambridge and Harvard. If at Harvard Square, which would be ground zero, everything to 1/3 of a mile in the red zone disappears instantaneously.
How many kilotons is that, Grant?
That's a 10 KT. A 10 kiloton bomb, which was the size of the bomb that Dragonfire was suggesting was in New York after 9/11. Everything out to the blue zone, which is about a mile, looks like the federal office building after a homegrown American terrorist, Timothy McVeigh, bombed it back in 1995. So a huge event.
By the way, Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. Right. So that'll put it in perspective for you.
And that's just one nuclear bomb in one city. If you want to see that for your own zip code, in nuclearterrorism.org, as is suggested in the handout, you can put in your own zip code and see what a 10 KT bomb would be.
But what you need to add to that is the whole place is contaminated for a generation. It's not just all the damage in a particular day.
Great. So the last point is we've already anticipated in the conversation what can be done to prevent it. We've got one last clip.
Now, Bernie, can you and this group of wizards here explain to me just how the hell we got here?
Sir, Al-Qaeda has computed all the Muslims killed in the past 50 years. Bosnia, Afghanistan, Somalia, the whole Middle East. Their spokesman has publicly announced that they believe they're owed 4 million lives.
Well, they posted it on their website.
Nukes would be the fastest way to vengeance. The only way to stop them from exploding a nuclear bomb is to keep the components out of their hands. No nuclear materials, no nuclear weapons, no nuclear terrorism.
If they have a warhead, we probably can't find it.
Or if they have plutonium or highly enriched uranium, they could find someone who can make them a bomb.
We've been finding bomb diagrams in Al-Qaeda camps ever since Afghanistan.
The U.S., Russia, and every other member of the G8 pledged $20 billion to help secure the weapons, the HEU, and the plutonium.
Then why can't we keep Al-Qaeda from going nuclear?
Well, I said pledge, sir. Reality is, we've not collected much cash or made much progress yet.
How much of this stuff is in Russia?
Enough to make 60 to 80,000 bombs, sir.
How much is secure?
Less than half. There's still at least 300 metric tons at risk.
And how long until you're done?
Our goal is to get it done in 4 years.
At the present rate, it'll take at least 13 years.
Come on, Nick. That rate, we'll all be dead before you finish.
It's complicated, sir. For example, both we and the Russians agreed that they needed fencing and nuclear sensors, which they can't afford. So we bought them. But then they can't pay to install them.
Well, we can.
We tried, but our lawyers say we need to be on every site to inspect the work to make sure it's done right.
And the Russians think we just want to spy. I mean, I heard that from Dmitry an hour ago.
We fight over travel visas, contracting rules, who pays if a worker gets hurt, who's liable in case of an accident.
Well, everyone here is going to be liable if an American city blows up. Nuclear terrorism is the most dangerous threat facing the world, and we're fighting over accounting rules and tax bills.
The terrorists are racing, and we're crawling.
All right, who in this group is responsible for nuclear terrorism? And who's in charge?
Okay. We've heard on the question of what's to be done. Kurt, I think, made a very clear statement about the proposition of locking stuff down wherever it is. And that, as the film says, is about half done. Jane, I think, was very clear on the proposition that if a president's not working on this problem every day, you're not going to get this ball to roll up the hill. And that's been a problem both in Republican and Democratic administration, so that's not a political point per se. So in terms of what to do, anything more that the group would like to say? And then I'm going to take us to the audience for questions. Anything more?
Let me
what
say
to do?
one thing that I think comes out of Kurt's point, that the Russian leadership can't account for a lot of these suitcase bombs and other nuclear material. We need the best possible intelligence to find out where it is or what happened to it, and we don't yet have that. Just to point out one thing, I think most of you have heard of A.Q. Khan, a decorated Pakistani hero who was the father of their nuclear bomb and apparently the father of the best arms sales, nuclear arms sales campaign in the history of the world. A.Q. Khan is now under house arrest in Pakistan. We are not able to debrief him. I think that's well known. No one really knows to this day how much of the plans or other materials that he was selling is still out there in the world. We did intersect a shipment going to Libya, and that unraveled Libya's WMD program, which was a big success. But where's the rest of it? And where is the intelligence capability worldwide to make sure we can figure that out quickly?
Well, I think there are sort of a series of priority steps. One of those is to do everything we can to keep out of the hands of any more countries this nuclear capability. There are now, what, about a dozen countries that...
Eight nuclear weapon states and one half pregnant, if you count North Korea.
Yeah.
As the mother on this panel,
I'm
there's
sorry,
no such thing.
Every time another country acquires capability, it makes the total problem of avoiding its misuse not just an addition of one, but exponentially a more serious matter. And we rely primarily on our Non-Proliferation Treaty and the enforcement of those treaties by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think it's time that we stopped trying to degrade that agency and turned our efforts to making it as efficient and effective as is humanly possible.
2 points. First of all, I took 2 delegations into North Korea, and I'll be hosting Ambassador Han from the DPRK mission at the UN this Wednesday in Washington.
And you were in North Korea just a month ago.
I was in there in January. Both times I went to North Korea, I sat across from Kim Gai-kwan, their lead negotiator. The last time for 10 hours over 3 days, the first time for 5 hours. And let me tell you what he said to me, and I want you to think about this when you respond. He said, wait a minute, America. You don't want us to have deterrence. You have nuclear deterrence. Israel has nuclear deterrence. Pakistan and India have nuclear deterrence. Why do you have an inconsistent policy toward us when we want nuclear deterrence so that no one attacks us? Try answering that question. Now, I did. I told him that the behavior of India and Pakistan and Israel certainly are not of a belligerent nation trying to attack nations, but we have a problem morally in terms of a foreign policy that denies, and I'm a strong supporter of Israel. Jane Harmon and I co-chair the security relationship with the Knesset. But the fact is, that's what a state like North Korea looks at. That we, in fact, turn our head when some nations have, in fact, developed nuclear weapons. In the case of India and Pakistan, just within the last 8 years. Second point. The reason we can't have success with Russia, in my opinion, and I spent a lot of time on this, I've been there about 45 times, is that the one thing we've never given Russia since 1992, the one thing she wants, it's not money, it's one thing. It's respect. In my opinion, we have never given Russia the respect that the Russian people and the Russian leaders feel are deserving of them. And that was under Bush 1, it was under Clinton, and it's under George W. right now. And I fight on that issue with Condi Rice and with the State Department every day of the week. The Russians are not convinced that we respect them. We still haven't elevated them out of Jackson Vanik, which was a dinosaur of a trade issue that's 10 years old. They're still under that. It's an embarrassment to them. We still do not respect them in terms of our relation. And so what Putin's doing is moving closer to the people he trusts. And who are they? They're the old KGB faction. So the FSB now has more and more authority, and Putin is making dumber and dumber public decisions. So in those two areas, we need to rebuild the respect to bring Russia back, because Russia will be critical to help us resolve the nuclear crisis in North Korea. The ultimate solution will be running energy from Sakhalin by pipeline down through North Korea into South Korea. And Russia will be critical in helping us deal with Iran. There is no country closer to Iran than Russia. They're the ones who designed the Bushehr nuclear power plant. They're the ones who designed the Shahab-3 missile system. And yet we don't have the leverage with Russia right now, and Condoleezza Rice was just rebuffed twice by the Iranians. My own feeling is our policies just don't get it. By the Russians, by the Russians. And so those are two areas that we really have to focus on. And the CIA, they just came out with a national intelligence estimate 1 month ago that Iran would not have a nuclear weapon for 10 years. That's as laughable as their national intelligence estimate in 1995, when they said there would not be an external ballistic missile threat to the U.S. for 15 years, and 3 years later in 1998, the North Koreans launched a Taepodong missile over Japan, and they had to reverse themselves. It's not going to be 10 years before Iran has a nuclear weapon. My prediction, it'll be less than 2 years.
Could I just say,
please?
There's another dimension to all this. We're talking about nation states here, but terrorist groups are not nation states. Sometimes they're failed states. I mean, one could say that the Taliban was the failed representation of Afghanistan, and maybe you could say that Hezbollah was the failed representation of Lebanon. Not that they are, well, let's hope that they don't have nuclear capability. But the point is, these old regimes that Bob's talking about do need to be vigorously enforced, but they're not between terrorist groups and us, or other Western countries. And so finding a handle on this thing when you're talking about rogue nations and rogue groups is much, much harder, exponentially harder than it was in the rational world of the Cold War.
Well, I would pick up on what Jane and Kurt have said. The attempts by these marginal nations to acquire nuclear weapons is not a stupid judgment. Suppose you were sitting in a place like Somalia or Yemen, and you had just observed two countries. One that allegedly has or is very close, as Kurt says, within 24 months of getting the bomb. What do we do with them? We negotiate through the Europeans. What do you do if you have a state which allegedly was attempting to get nuclear weapons maybe within the next 5 years? We sent the military in and took over the country, Iraq. What lesson would you draw? The way to secure yourself from U.S. military invasion is to get the bomb. We are sending a very negative message for our own national security.
Okay, let me take us to the audience here. We've got microphones on both sides down here and in the first loges. And the rules of the game here are, please introduce yourself, state a question. Questions are short and to the point, and then we're going to try to get short questions and short answers.
And no tomatoes.
Okay. And no tomatoes. Mike, why don't we start with you? And please introduce yourself.
I'm Mike Hines. I'm with RAND Corporation. And I'm wondering if we can modernize the NPT to reflect the modern era we're in, or if we really need a new international agreement to carry us forward.
Okay, so the question is about the Non-Proliferation Treaty and whether it needs to be modernized and updated, or alternatively, it needs to be supplemented or with some new international treaty. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we were hoping that would happen. I was up at the UN with Ed Markey and Hans Blix for a conference over the summer, and we were hoping that all the nations would come together with the U.S. in kind of a leadership role to modernize the NPT. That hasn't happened yet. It's very troubling to me, and part of the biggest problem is the inspection criteria and getting countries like North Korea and others to allow us to have unfettered access to their sites in Iran. But I think we have to continue to pursue that. It's critically important that we have the leadership from this country to reduce the possibility of it. In fact, 2 years ago, I formed the Nuclear Strategy Forum, which is a bipartisan effort in Washington with some of the top names in the country. I mean, everybody's spoken there. We just had John Hamre speak, Sam Nunn has spoken, and John Spratt. I think Jane's been there. And the goal there is to have a discussion about what is the proper role of nuclear weapons in the 21st century? Do we need them anymore? Or from that extreme to the other extreme, maybe more reliance on nuclear weapons. We've never really had that debate. Now, the problem is DOD tried to, for 2 years, resist the nuclear strategy forum. And I had to get outside funding for it. Now, finally this year, hopefully in our defense appropriation bill, we'll put the first $700,000 in there to run it. But America needs a national debate on what is the role of nuclear weapons. I mean, it worked during the Cold War because there were two superpowers and they deterred each other. But what do we do with nuclear weapons when today we don't have two superpowers? We have a bunch of rogue groups and rogue states that want to acquire this capability to do exactly what was just said here, to basically stop America from doing anything in their territory. So that debate has to take place, and it's not taking place, in my opinion, the way it should in this country.
I agree with that. I think it's a fair question. The NPT is, in some ways, to quote a former White House operative who's now our Attorney General, quaint. But I would argue that it is still useful and that it matters to states who are signatories to be part of it. But it does need to be supplemented, and I'm just reading from this, my favorite book here. I got an autographed copy, and I hope you will too.
This is the best press agent I ever had.
Where we need to be a world of three no's, and the three no's are no loose nukes, no new nascent nukes, and no new nuclear weapons states. And if the UN or some other international organization could be a forum, I agree about Kurt about a debate here, but I think it's got to be beyond America, for getting these three no's to be adopted either as an international treaty or an international understanding. I think that would be a way forward.
Just one small ad. Al Baraday, who's the director of the IAEA, will be here for a forum on November 2nd, I think it is. It's either November 2nd or 3rd. November 1st. That's pretty close. This gentleman.
Yes, since the recipe for
Please introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, David Taylor is my name, graduate of the college. Since the recipe for a fission device is in the public domain, it seems that the only hope to stop terrorists is to stop their access to nuclear weapons or nuclear materials. My question is, leaving aside the fact that we are not doing what we could do with the Russians, let's assume we could do that or do that, what other steps should the government be taking to try to deny potential terrorists access to the materials, which is really all they need? And in light of former Senator Graham's comment, should such preventive action include preventive war if necessary?
Well, we have always avoided making a declarative position that the United States would not use nuclear weapons, including not using them in a preemptive manner. And we continue to take that position. I guess there are circumstances that might be extreme enough that we would take preemptive action, not hopefully nuclear action, in order to avoid there being another state added to the list of nuclear powers. As you know, Israel bombed Iraq, 25 or so years ago, when there was reason to believe that they were developing a nuclear capability under the pretense of commercial use, which would have weapons implications.
But my understanding from your earlier comment was you were saying it is counterproductive, or we will not ultimately prevail if we adopt such a policy. In other words, a policy of taking preventive war, if you will, against a state actor or even against some non-state actor would be something that's counterproductive. And I think that the present administration, at least from my understanding, has taken the position, and certainly that's what they did in Iraq, that we should take such action. So the real question is that really going to help us, or not? I think you've suggested it will not help us.
Well, my point was that we're in a situation now where we've created a positive, rational incentive for states to want to go nuclear. And that is that if they have the bomb, we negotiate. If we think they are attempting to get the bomb, we use military force. And that is not a constructive policy.
Okay. Let's go to this gentleman.
Hello, my name is Stephen Ridgel. I'm a senior at the college. I'm also from Torrance, California, Congresswoman Harmon's district. Yes, ma'am. I remember your visit to my high school a few years back. Very pleasant experience. But taking into consideration the avenue of the Russian acquisition, the acquisition of nuclear materials from Russia, and I'm coming from a standpoint of being concerned with Islamic extremist sources of terrorism. I've been thinking about that the Islamic terrorists would need to contact Russian sources in order to acquire the material from this avenue, which may be difficult. I don't know if those contacts are well developed, taking into account like the invasion of Afghanistan. I'm not sure if those relationships are there. So they would need to somehow get into contact with the Russians. So my question's about intelligence reform. Is there an avenue through which the CIA can kind of address this, try and make contact, through the same avenues that the Islamics would try and make contact with the Russians? Does the current intelligence reform kind of address this?
Well, I think Kurt can speak more specifically to Russia, but the goal of the intelligence reform effort of last year was to give us better tools to have good dots and then connect them appropriately. Better collection, better analysis, and someone who would drive the whole thing. I mean, we haven't yet commented on that snippet we saw where President Thompson asks, whose portfolio includes proliferation? Everybody. Who's in charge? Nobody. That's the situation we were in before the intelligence reform. Hopefully now, through this Directorate of National Intelligence, which is off to a slow start, unfortunately, in my view, we will get better at this, and we will have better, accurate, and actionable information that will give us the leads you're talking about. But are we at that stage now? I would say absolutely not are we at that stage. And tracking not just conversations, whatever they may be, and boy, the terrorists are very sophisticated, in case anyone missed it. They use the internet, and they use ways of communication, physical runners sometimes, that are hard for us to track. They don't just talk on cell phones, which they have clearly understood through a series of leaks we can hear. So it's very hard to know what they're talking about. It's also hard, just remember this video, to keep track of slices, I guess that's what you'd call it, of HEU in somebody's briefcase when he walks out of an unguarded facility in South Africa, et cetera. So this is the hardest problem there is, and especially if they are not dealing with organized state actors whom we're used to dealing with, but rogue entities and terrorist cells, which it seems to me they perfectly well could be.
Well, I would say two quick things. One, we have an enormous challenge to recruit, train, and properly use the next generation of human intelligence. And I think that needs to be one of our highest priorities. Second, I believe that what we've just done with the intelligence agencies in 2004 is the equivalent of what happened to the military services in 1947. That is, we brought the Army and the Navy and the newly formed Air Force together under a single secretary. That was better than the old way, but we learned that it was not sufficient. And so in 1986, we took the next step, which was to restructure around missions, defined primarily in geographic terms. I think that's the next step for the intelligence agency, and clearly one of those missions is going to be the avoidance of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I just hope that it doesn't take us the same almost 35 to 40 years to do it in the intelligence agency that it did in the Department of Defense.
Kurt, do you want to make a comment on the Russian piece of it?
Well, just briefly, and on the intelligence in general. Intelligence is the critical issue for the next 50 years, for your lifetime, for our lifetime.
And a great opportunity for some students.
Right, exactly. And we don't have good intelligence, and all the other work we do is for naught. And I'll be honest, and I've been very critical of the intelligence community, and thank goodness we have people like Jane on the Oversight Committee. My contention is that Congress, except for this gentleman here who's not with us, has not done an aggressive job in overseeing the intelligence agencies. Now let me just point out some facts to you. The CIA did not predict the fall of the Soviet Union. The CIA did not predict the fall of communism. Our arch enemy for 70 years, and we're spending billions of dollars on intelligence, and nobody predicted that communism was going to end, the Soviet Union was going to fall. They did not want to take in Vasily Mitrokhin in '93, the highest ranking ever defector. They said, no, we don't need you. And the Brits took him in. In '95, their national intelligence estimates said we wouldn't have a threat from an external ballistic missile for 15 years. 3 years later, the North Koreans launched a three-stage Taepodong missile that the CIA did not know they had. They totally missed it. In 2000, they missed it on the run-up to 9/11. And so even though we have good agents and good human intelligence, I have a fundamental problem with the upper-level management, and that needs aggressive oversight by the House and the Senate. In the House side, and Porter Goss is a friend of mine, but I think he had an ultimate goal. He wanted to go work for the agency. It's tough to be very critical of an agency where you want to go work. And I'm very aggressively critical of the intelligence agency, as Jane knows. That's why they won't put me on the Intelligence Oversight Committee. And to be honest with you, I don't want to be on the Intelligence Oversight Committee because they tend to have a way, if you're weak, of co-opting you. They'll show you all the gizmos and the wows and gee whiz, I know this and I know that. And then you won't go out and do the kind of job that you have to do, that people like Jane and the good senator here have done. You need to ask tough questions. I mean, we didn't fire one person after 9/11. Not one person. There's something wrong. And so intelligence to me is the critical piece in terms of understanding where the emerging threats are and then being able to respond. And that's why I'm such a strong supporter of the intelligence reforms. I hope that Negroponte and this jointness will work, but I still think and have a gut feeling there's still stovepipes there that have to still be torn down. It's going to require us as citizens to demand that these changes take place. It's not easy. It's an agency that can operate quietly behind the scenes. There aren't many members of Congress willing to take on the CIA publicly. You know why.
Let's go to this gentleman here at the lodge.
Hi, my name is Josh Potashnik. I'm a junior at the college. I read Professor Allison's book last year, and I'm sure you've heard this before. My main reaction to it was astonishment that there hasn't been an attack already, given the state of things as you described them. I was wondering if the panelists could comment on what you all think the biggest reason is why there hasn't been an attack yet. Is there a lack of contact between the terrorists and the Russians? Is there a lack of technical expertise? Are they on the run because of operations in Afghanistan? What do you think is the biggest reason why there hasn't been an attack yet, and what policy implications does that have?
Good question.
I think we have had some successes in certainly arresting or killing the top management of Al-Qaeda. We truly have had some successes. It's not that they can't grow replacements, and they do, but we have weakened Al-Qaeda at the top. On the other hand, Al-Qaeda as a top-down organization has been replaced by what I call franchise terrorism. Think McDonald's. And now you have copycat cells all over the world that don't necessarily ask permission from Uncle Osama. And in so many ways, we have a more lethal threat now than we did, but we have had some successes. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is, at least thinking about Al-Qaeda and the MO of Al-Qaeda, they are looking for a truly catastrophic moment. They want to top even 9/11, and that will be very hard to pull off. And we do have, not everywhere, but we have increased vigilance in this country. By some very good police departments, New York and LA come to mind, by the FBI, which gets criticized all the time, but does have, through the Joint Terrorism Task Force mechanism, ability in some places that are big targets to do a much better job than it did. And we have had intelligence reform, which hopefully will succeed, but which does create jointness, a horizontal organization across the intelligence agencies, which is doing a better job. But are we vulnerable to a radiological bomb? You bet. Could it happen any day? You bet. Could it happen because the guy who lives next door to you, who is not a Muslim male, has been radicalized someplace, think, American prisons or somewhere else, and is somebody who's never been to Afghanistan or Iraq, and that guy has figured this out somehow? You bet.
I think it's very difficult to obtain weapons-grade plutonium, and I think that's why you haven't seen a weapon used, because it's the IAEA, for all the criticism it's given, does a decent job in controlling the highest grade material that could, in fact, be used for a bomb. I think that's critical, and that's why we have to continue to support those efforts. Let me throw out to you something that's kind of a curveball, and because I think this kind of device will not be used unless it's a dirty nuke. But I'll tell you what I think would likely be used. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out, because it presents all kind of moral dilemmas. If I'm an adversary of the U.S., and I want to take out the United States, I don't know that I want to use a nuclear weapon, because I'm going to wreak havoc, I'm going to kill millions of people. Maybe what I want to do is bring you to your knees. Well, how can I bring you to your knees? I take a low-yield nuclear weapon, and I don't put it in a suitcase. I put it on the end of a low-complexity missile. Now, let's take Iran's Shahab-3 missile, which they have. They deployed it last year. Let's say Iran sells one of those missiles, and either a rogue state or a terrorist group puts it on a freighter and puts it off of our eastern coast and launches that Shahab-3 over America with a low-yield nuclear weapon on the tip of it and detonates it in the atmosphere. Now, the moral dilemma is nobody gets injured. No people get killed, because the detonation occurred above the atmosphere of our territory. But a phenomenon that our military knows very well, the Soviet military knows very well, the Chinese military knows very well, a phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse, given off by that detonation of that nuclear weapon, fries all the electronics of the nation below it. So what you do to America, you take us back to the 1700s. You shut down our telecommunications, our electric grid, you shut down air traffic control, you shut down communications, you shut down every vehicle, because every vehicle has a computer chip in it, and you burn it out. So there you've got a real moral dilemma. Somebody chooses to use a nuclear weapon not to kill people, but to have an electromagnetic pulse laid down on our country that basically takes us back to the Dark Ages. That's what I think, if I were in the shoes of a terrorist, I would look at doing. Or if I, in fact, were a nation state that did not want to have my fingerprints on killing. And what would we do then? Let's suppose we even knew who the perpetrator was. Would we nuke that country? Because none of our people would be killed. They simply would take us back to what the people of the Gulf region had after Hurricane Katrina. No communication, no electric grid, no power, no vehicles. Everything shuts down. Now that's a real vulnerability. 4 years ago, the Congress, not the administration, mandated an EMP commission of top scholars. They just finished their report last year and gave it to us. If you want to read something that poses a nuclear threat to us, read the EMP Commission unclassified report, and that'll scare you, believe me, because that is doable. And that's if I were a terrorist or I was a nation state, that's what I would do. And if China wants to take over Taiwan, you detonate a nuclear device above Taiwan, you shut Taiwan down. It has no communication, no capability to respond, because none of their systems are hardened, and you simply walk across the straits and take over the country. That's a real scenario.
We're coming close to the witching hour. I'm going to let this gentleman and this gentleman each put their questions, and then the panelists can address both of them. Please, briefly.
Andrew Woodcock, researcher at the National Bureau of Economic Research. From a nuclear attack perspective, does the panel have a consensus between you on which city in the world you would least like to live in?
Good. Very good question, and it can be a short answer. And you, please.
My name's Wick Sloan. I'm just a plain old citizen, and I thank
Good.
you for coming
Welcome.
tonight. And you've succeeded in worrying me even more than when I saw the film. And I ask this question in the hope that the two representatives from Congress will tell me that I've missed the point and I'm dead wrong. But the only thing more alarming to me than the issue before us is what appears to be complacency from two senior members of Congress on what you're doing about this relative to the power that you have as members of Congress. You have parliamentary procedures. You can stop the president and the budget, and I'm not naive. I understand how the government works. That my question is one from sophistication. If that fails, and this is as important as it is, you can have a hunger strike or blockade the hearings for Harriet Myers or whatever. But I mean, what have you got on? Please tell me what do you have on the table on the floor right now that you're at risk for because of the seriousness of this, and please tell us what it is, and we can get on board and help you.
Wow.
We're going to take the last two questions, Bill says. Again, brief questions, this gentleman and this one here, please.
My name is Craig. I'm a Harvard alum and a concerned citizen. I want to thank you all for what you've done for our country. I would just say that in watching the film and in studying our U.S. policy, it seems to me that it all relies on a trust of countries like Russia and China, ones that I definitely do respect, and I think they deserve our respect, but I don't think they necessarily deserve our trust. You cite the treaty violations by these countries. I would certainly cite William T. Lee's The ABM Treaty Charade. I'm familiar with Peter Vincent Pry's work, War Scare. He certainly expresses a concern about what the inner circle of the Russian General Staff still thinks about America. I'm familiar with Stanislav Lunev in his book. I'm also familiar that in 1997, he said, if a nuclear weapon ever explodes in America and they blame it on Islamic terrorists, don't believe them, because it would be my people, the Spetsnaz. If you read Viktor Suvorov's book, Spetsnaz, from the 1980s, that is like a book detailing how to be a terrorist, how to recruit terrorists, and how to use terrorists as proxies. You cite that the Central Intelligence Agency never predicted the fall of communism. Well, Anatoly Golitsyn predicted the fall of communism in 1984. Congressman Weldon, you talk about the corruption in the DIA just last week in the House, talking about able danger. I'm very concerned about corruption. Our own U.S. government cited in the International Crime Threat Assessment in 2000 that corruption is endemic worldwide. Dr. Joseph D. Douglas cites in his works on corruption and terrorism and narcotics trafficking and how they're interrelated.
Let me get to the question briefly.
Yes, what is the prudence of trusting countries that do not show that they are deserving of our trust, and that everything in our security depends on this?
Good. Very thoughtful question, and this is the last one, please.
Hi, I'm Alexander Lee. I'm a sophomore at the college. My question is actually regarding the anti-ballistic missile shield proposed by President Bush. Now, all of the panelists here have mentioned that smaller states have a very strong incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. And it's my understanding that if successful, a missile shield over the U.S. could reduce these incentives by forcing them to either play into an arms race that they can't afford or to build a missile shield of their own. Do you believe that this is a sound strategy for preventing nuclear proliferation in the future?
Okay, why don't we try to see each person can answer one question and one of you can answer two. So pick your question or what you would like to say and offer your answer.
I'll do the ABM
Okay,
treaty
good.
first and the missile. The reason we moved forward missile defense is because the Russians, who are the other signatory of the ABM treaty, have had an ABM system around Moscow since the treaty was first signed back in the 70s. It's called the Galash system. It's been upgraded 3 times. We offered to them, take down your system and be as vulnerable as we are. And the Russians said, no way. But to do that, we need to have a cooperative partnership with Russia. This administration has stopped that partnership. We had one joint program with the Russians called the Ramos program. A year ago, we ended that. To me, that sends the wrong signal. It is the wrong thing to do. In terms of what should we be doing, the gentleman says he wants to know where we're doing. Well, get on my website. I mean, you can ask what are we doing, but it's also a part of an informed citizen to know what we're doing. I shouldn't have to come here and in 5 minutes tell you what I'm doing and justify it. My whole life is about this. I mean, if you go on my website, and if you really care, as Jane Harmon, no one has spent as much time on these issues as Jane Harmon has. In fact, if you want to look at what I had to do, 2 years ago, I got frustrated with the CIA. I took them on publicly. And I wrote a book, and you all can see it, and then publicly I say that you can't trust the CIA. Now, there aren't many members of Congress willing to do that, but I'm doing that, and I'm taking them on, and trying to make Jane's job easier. I'll be the bad guy, and let Jane and Pete Hoekstra and the other good members of that committee be the decent people that go in and say, hey, you got to watch, Weldon's after you. You know, let's get this agency and its coordination. There are many people doing good things, but you can't come here in 5 minutes and say all the things that are being done. That's kind of ridiculous.
It's not the least ridiculous, sir. If two people of your ability were doing everything you could, I think this would be fixed, and I invite you to ask for our help. And I think your reply that we should look at your website is...
No, I'm saying be informed.
I'm very
let me
informed,
respond
and the
to that,
problem
sir.
isn't solved.
You know, I've never heard anyone call Kurt Weldon complacent, so this is a first. But the two of us and many others, certainly Bob Graham when he was there, worked very hard at this. We're not perfect. We're members of different parties. We try to use the levers of power that we have to make a difference. I feel some ownership over this intelligence reform bill of last year, and I think it will make a difference. And Kurt has had a huge amount to do with some of these non-proliferation issues. But neither of us is the elected leader of our party in the Congress. Neither of us has control over what the agenda is in the Congress or the agenda of any one specific committee. Kurt is the #2 member of the Armed Services Committee. I'm the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, which sometimes I call the oppressed minority. So it is very hard to set an agenda consistent with what we passionately believe in. But we try, and I think our voices are heard more than many of the other voices. I just want to make one last comment about voices, and I'm looking at Carrie. The 9/11 families have been an extraordinarily loud and constructive voice. Each of them endured unspeakable tragedy. Any of us could have had relatives in those buildings. That's certainly true. I almost did, as a matter of fact. My son was working in one of those towers the prior week, but wasn't there that week. And so I was lucky, personally. But the 9/11 families took their grief and made it into something positive. And you talk about organized public involvement. Look at her introducing this panel. Look at the things that they have done to pass the intelligence reform bill, a number of other things, and keep attention focused on something that should happen, which is reform of Congress, so that we can do this job better. We're not organized properly. Kerry knows it, the 9/11 Commission knows it, but it doesn't change. That's wrong. And that voice, your voice, will get louder and louder, and I just want to say as a grateful citizen, thank you to the 9/11 families.
And she did it with no money, no financial support.
You want to answer any others of the questions? Yeah.
The question about which is the city that is of greatest vulnerability, I think I know the answer to that question. I'm not going to announce it tonight, but I think it will be a city which is selected primarily for its symbolic importance. What terrorists want to do is to terrify, and you terrify by selecting those sites which will raise the highest level of apprehension. On the question about the space shield, I personally did not support that for this reason. A, I think it would take one of the stupidest leaders in the history of mankind to use a missile as the means of attacking the United States. You have your name, your signature, your national flag on that missile, or there are plenty of other means of determining from whence it came, and we are committed, as we were during the Cold War, to massive retaliation for anyone who launches an attack against us or one of our treaty allies. So it would be to accept immediate suicide. But I'm also concerned that we are spending the funds on this shield against a highly unlikely event, and we aren't spending the money to do the kinds of things that Graham details in his book. We've got to, at some point, have a sense of relative priorities. And to me, the relative priority that I'm the most committed to is to avoid nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. I think that's a much greater threat than some deranged leader who happens to have a small arsenal trying to launch it on the United States with the prospect of national suicide as the consequence.
We'll give Kurt the last word, if you would.
I just enjoyed being here, and Graham, I too want to add my thanks to your great work. I've been up here several occasions with you, and Graham is doing the kind of grassroots work to bring us closer with our archenemy for 7 years, and that is the former Soviet states, and that's critically important. And we'll continue to fight back in Washington. It's not easy. I mean, it would seem to be logical, but there are a lot of other priorities, and I can tell you, back in our districts, there aren't many people clamoring for the kind of things that we're doing because they don't see the direct relationship to their lives. My constituents want to know about the local economy. They want to know about their jobs. They want to know about their health care. You know, I don't have them coming in and saying, hey, what are you doing right now on nuclear proliferation? And that's a problem. The other thing I would say as an educator is I don't think we do enough to sensitize our young people to other cultures. I think one of the reasons we get into problems is that we don't take the time. I'm embarrassed. How many of our schools teach Chinese? How many of our schools teach Korean? How many teach Russian? How many teach Arabic or Farsi? If we're ever going to expect to have a relationship with these other countries and people, we ought to at least try to understand them. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but we at least ought to understand them. And I can tell you, in my own district, I have one school that teaches Chinese. Yet Chinese is the most spoken language on the face of the earth. Well, how do we ever expect to find a common ground and have common understanding and trust if we don't take the time to reach out to understand other peoples who might one day be our enemy? So I think we all are in this together. This is not all going to be solved in Washington. It's going to be solved at our local school board level, at our county level. It's going to really be resolved by groups like this, group here at Harvard, and like other interested groups around the country. So Graham, I applaud you. It's an honor to be on the same podium with these great Democrats, and hopefully I hold up the Republican side at least part of the way.
Indeed. So let me say thank you very much to our panelists who've done a terrific job. Thanks for Bob Graham letting us draft him here at the last minute. He was going to be in Florida, but the hurricane kept him here, and we're glad that it did for our purposes. For Last Best Chance, the video we saw, as Kerry announced, if you go to their website, nti.org, you can order a copy of it, and they're giving them away free. So it's the price is right. And we thank you very much for coming. I think in the material that was distributed, we identified 2 upcoming forums that will relate to this topic. One with Mohammed al-Baradei, the director of IAEA, which is the 1st of November. And then on the 3rd of November, I think Secretary of Defense Perry is going to be here for a forum event. So you got more coming up, but let's say thanks very much to our panelists. Good. You guys were great.